Welcome to Staffworks Explained. If you are here for the first time, please consider subscribing to this channel. In this video, we'll be talking about the Lamu $16 billion bet and what Dangote's refinery means for Kenya and the East Africa as a whole. We have a 700,000 barrels a day refinery on the Kenya's coast. We have an investment that now reported at about $16 billion. We have a financing model which is roughly 70% coming from debt and 30% coming from equity. And then we have a construction target for October. So those are the numbers behind the Aliko Dangote's proposed refinery at Lamu. But the real story is not the size of the check. It is whether the economics in that check really makes sense. Where will the refinery get its crude? Who will buy the fuel? Can Lamu compete with Tanga, where Uganda's crude is already headed? What happens when Uganda's smaller Hoima refinery comes on stream? And how much of Ethiopia's fuel market can Lamu realistically capture when Ethiopia already has established supply routes through Djibouti and also is developing its own refining capacity? Then there is the biggest question of all. Can a project largely financed through debt generate enough reliable cash for decades to repay that debt? That is the question that should sit behind the headlines. So first, what exactly has been announced? We have the proposal for a refinery at Lamu on the Kenya's north coast with a planned capacity of about 700,000 barrels of crude oil per day. Recent reporting has put the investment at around $16 billion, although earlier reports used a figure close to $17 billion. Dangote has indicated that construction could begin in October 2026 and take less than 4 years. If completed at that scale, it would be one of Africa's largest refining facilities and slightly bigger than Dangote's existing refinery in Lekki, Lagos, which has a nameplate of capacity of about 650,000 barrels. But there is an important distinction between construction announcement and bankable project. A refinery of this size requires detailed engineering, environmental and regulatory approvals, financing, contracts for major equipment, infrastructure agreements, and eventually commissioning. Most importantly, there is a financial close. This is when the lenders have actually committed the money under binding agreements, and the conditions for drawing down those funds have been met. So when you hear that construction will begin in October 2026, the next question should be, has the project reached financial close, and on what terms? That is where the story becomes much more interesting. Let's look at the 1.5 trillion Kenya shillings question. The reported financing structure is roughly 70% debt and 30% equity. So 70% will be borrowed money, 30% will be own money. If you use the latest reported project cost of $16 billion, 70% would amount to approximately $11.2 billion in debt, with about $4.8 billion in equity. At exchange rate around 120 plus level to the dollar, that puts the debt requirements in the neighborhood of 1.4 trillion to 1.5 trillion Kenya shillings. That explains the widely reported 1.545 trillion figure Kenya shillings. But it is important not to describe that as 1.45 trillion Kenya shillings as already borrowed. It is the approximate debt component of the proposed financing structure. The public announcement has not yet provided the complete details for lending syndicate, interest rates, repayment schedule, security arrangements, as well as any government guarantees. Those details matter hugely. Debt can make a very profitable project even more attractive to its owners, despite the investors, having do not have to provide all the capital. But debt also creates a fixed obligation. The refinery will have to pay its lenders whether margins are strong or weak. That makes the bank that means the bank will not be primarily interested in the size of the refinery. They will be interested in the reliability of the cash flow. They will want to know how much crude will refinery process, at what utilization, at what cost, what products will it produce, who will buy them, at what prices, and what happens with the project if if refining margins fall for several years. That is the financial test. Then the question, how does a refinery actually make money? That's important to understand. This is what we're explaining because the word refinery can make economics sound simpler than they are. A refinery buys crude oil and processes it into products such as petrol, diesel, jet fuel, LPG, and other petroleum products. The refinery makes money from difference between the value of those products and the cost of the crude, energy, labor, maintenance, transport, financing, and other operating expenses. That difference is commonly described through refining margins. And margins fluctuate. A refinery can be highly profitable when refined product prices are strong relatively to crude prices. It can also face difficult conditions when crude becomes expensive or product prices weaken. So the fact that Lamu could process 700,000 barrels a day does not mean it will necessarily make money on 700,000 barrels every day. The plant must have crude available. It must operate efficiently. It must have buyers, and it must keep enough of its capacity working to generate the cash assumed in its financial model. For a project carrying more than 11 billion US dollars in debt, the last point becomes especially important. The question investors should eventually ask is not simply what is the refining capacity. It is at what level of utilization does this refinery cover its operating cost and debt service. That number will tell us much more about the business. Another question is why Lamu? The most obvious advantage is its location on coast. Lamu gives Dangote access to imported crude by sea, potentially allows the refinery to source crude from international markets rather than depending entirely on production from Kenya and neighboring countries. There is also the much larger LAPSSET corridor, the Lamu Port South Sudan Ethiopia Transport Corridor LAPSSET. The original LAPSSET concept was intended to turn Lamu into a major transport and logistics gateway connecting Kenya with Ethiopia and South Sudan. A refinery could become a major industrial anchor within that system. But there is a catch. A refinery cannot operate in isolation. It needs crude storage facilities, marine handling, product storage, pipelines, and transport links. The finished fuel has to move efficiently to customers in Kenya and potentially across the region. In other words, the project is not simply the construction of a refinery. It is the construction or expansion of an entire energy logistics systems around the refinery. Then, where does the 700k barrels of crude oil come from? This is one of the hardest questions. Kenya's own resources are not sufficient to supply a refinery of this scale. Uganda is different. Uganda has substantial oil resources and developing its production at Lake Albert. But Uganda's oil is being moved towards Tanzania coast through the East African crude oil pipeline, EACOP, which terminates at Chongoleani near Tanga. That creates an obvious strategic advantage for Tanga. If your crude is already traveling to Tanga, processing it there could reduce the distance between the crude arrival point and refinery. Lamu has a different proposition. Because it is a coastal refinery, it could potentially source crude from the wider international market. That gives it flexibility. But flexibility comes with a price. Imported crude must be shipped in, stored, and transported through a system that has to remain competitive with other supply routes. So the question is not simply whether Lamu can obtain crude. It is, can Lamu obtain the right crude at a competitive delivered cost for decades? That is what the feasibility study and financing documents will ultimately have to demonstrate. And then there is the Tanga question. This is where the regional story becomes much more interesting. Only months ago, the conversation around major refinery region for that matter was focused heavily on Tanga in Tanzania. Tanzania and Uganda have now signed an agreement to advance cooperation around a Tanga regional energy hub involving refining, storage, and petroleum logistics. The logic is straightforward. Uganda produces crude. EACOP, East African Crude Oil Pipeline, takes that crude to Tanga. Tanga has a major port, a refinery and a storage complex in that place could then process the crude and distribute petroleum products into regional markets. That gives Tanga a natural feedstock advantage. But Lamu has its own strategic advantages. It is in Kenya. It sits within the Lapset corridor. It is positioned to serve northern Kenya and potentially Ethiopia and South Sudan. So the real question is not which port looks better on map. It is which system can deliver fuel to customers at lowest reliable cost. That means calculating the cost of crude, refining, storage, transport and distribution all the way to the market. Then there is another complication, which is Hoima. This complicates the picture further. Uganda is also pursuing its own refinery at Hoima with a proposed capacity of 60,000 barrels per day. This is much smaller than Lamu, almost 10 times, which is proposed large refinery. It's also smaller than the proposed refinery at Tanga. Uganda's position has been that its domestic refinery can proceed alongside a regional refinery. There's a commercial logic to that. 60,000 barrel a day plant could serve Uganda's domestic market and provide a degree of domestic refining capacity. A much larger regional refinery would be designed to serve multiple markets. But the existence of several projects raises a legitimate question. Will East Africa eventually have enough demand to support all of this refining capacity? It is too early to answer that definitively. Demand for petroleum products in the region is growing, and the region will still imports large quantities of refined fuel. But demand growth cannot simply be assumed to absorb every proposed refinery. The projects will ultimately compete on efficiency, product quality, crude cost, and logistics, as well as market access. Then there is still another question of Ethiopia. Could it become a major consumer or customer? But it is not a guarantee. Ethiopia is one of the most important pieces of the Lamu proposition. It has a huge population and substantial demand for transport and industrial fuels. That makes it an obvious potential market for Lamu. But Ethiopia already has a functioning fuel supply relationship through Djibouti. Djibouti is expanding petroleum storage, liquid bulk handling infrastructure, while Ethiopia is also developing the Gode refinery project in its own Somali region. That means Lamu will not be entering an empty market. It will have to compete. The critical question, therefore, is not whether Ethiopia needs petroleum products. It clearly does. The question is whether a liter of fuel delivered from Lamu can compete economically with a liter delivered through Djibouti or eventually produced domestically. Distance alone will not answer that question. The calculation has to include transport cost, storage, border procedures, taxes, infrastructure, and also reliability. If Lamu can consistently beat those alternatives on delivered cost, Ethiopia could become a major market. If it cannot, the size of Ethiopia's population will not rescue the business model. So, what does Dangote's Lekki Lagos experience tell us? It tells us two things. First, Dangote has already demonstrated that it can build and operate a refinery as enormous as what is being proposed. That is important. Second, Lagos demonstrates just how difficult these projects can become. The Nigerian refinery ultimately became a roughly $20 billion investment after years of construction and development. It began operations in 2024 and reached full capacity in 2026, according to Reuters. Dangote has argued that the lessons learned in Nigeria can help make Lamu faster and also less expensive to finance and construct. That is a reasonable argument. But Lamu is not Lagos. That is obvious. The regulatory environment is different. The port infrastructure is different. Crude supply arrangements are different. The market is also different. So experience reduces execution risk. It does not eliminate it. So where will the equity come from? That's another question that is need to be answered. This is another part of the financing story that deserves attention. Reuters has reported that Dangote intends to use combination of internal cash flows, bonds, and initial public offer to support the Kenyan project. Nigerian Dangote Refinery has also recently raised 2.5 billion US dollars through a private placement, while the company is targeting a proposed 5 billion in IPO. That is significant because the equity requirement for a 16 billion US dollars project financed through 70% debt would be roughly 4.8 billion dollars. But we should not assume that the entire IPO proceeds will automatically go to Lamu. The Nigerian refinery itself has expansion plans and other capital requirements. The precise allocation will matter. What is clear is that Dangote is building a broader capital raising strategy around its energy business rather than relying on one source of funding. For Kenya, the important question is whether that strategy eventually translates into committed capital for the Lamu project. Now, another question is, should Kenya protect the refinery? This could become one of the most politically difficult questions. A new refinery will have to compete with imported fuel from from some of the world's most efficient refining centers, including the Gulf and the Asia. If imported diesel or petrol is cheaper, consumers will naturally prefer the cheaper products. But a refinery carrying billions of dollars in debt may struggle if it has to compete under all market conditions. That creates constraints for government protection through tariffs, import restrictions, preferential arrangement, as well as other policies. There's a legitimate argument for supporting strategic infrastructure, but there is also a consumer question. If protections makes the refinery viable but raises the cost of imported alternatives, consumers may ultimately pay part of the price. Kenya, therefore, needs to be very clear about where the commercial risk ends and public policy starts. If there are government guarantees, guaranteed offtake arrangements, or special fiscal treatment, the terms should be transparent. Now, will it lower the price of the fuel? That's a question that also needs to be answered. That claim should be treated carefully. A refinery could reduce some costs associated with importing finished products. It could also retain more of the refining value within the region, but the pump prices depends on much more than refining. There is the international pricing of the crude, there is freight, there are taxes and levies, there is storage, transport, distribution, foreign exchange, and margins throughout the supply chain. So a refinery does not automatically translate into dramatically cheaper petrol. It is more immediate. Strategic benefit could be supply security and greater control over the regional petroleum value chain. Whether that eventually translates into lower prices will depend on how efficiently the refinery operates and how the government structures the market. Now, let's look at the project management test. For all the political announcement, there are a few milestones that will tell you whether Lamu is becoming a real project. The first is financial closure. Who exactly is lending the money and on what terms? The second is feedstock security. Are there farm arrangements for crude supply? The third is offtake. Who has committed to buying the refinery products? The fourth is infrastructure. Are port, storage, pipelines, transport system being developed alongside the refinery? And fifth is execution. Does construction remain within the promised cost and schedule? These are much better indicators than a ground breaking. Now, the hard questions that Kenya should be asking. Before the project becomes too politically difficult questions, several issues deserve clear answers. And these are about 10 questions. First question is, what is the final project cost? Is it 16 billion? Is it 17 billion or something else? What exactly does the reported 1.5 or 4.45 trillion US dollars debt represent? Which lenders are involved? What are the interest rates and repayment terms? Will Kenya provide guarantees or other forms of support? What crude will refinery process? Where will it come from? How much will be imported by sea? Which companies or the governments have committed to buying the refined products? What assumptions about fuel demand underpin the financial model? And what happens to the economics if Tanga develops into a major regional refinery and energy hub? Those are not hostile questions. They are the questions any serious investor, lender, or government should be asking before committing billions of dollars. So, is Lamu viable? There is a credible case. East Africa imports large quantities of refined petroleum products. Demand is expected to remain significant. Kenya has a strategic coastal position, and Lamu offers access to both international crude and regional market. Dangote has also the experience of operating one of the world's largest new refineries, but viability has not yet been demonstrated publicly in full. The project still has to prove its financing structure, crude supply strategy, customer base, as well as logistics economics. And the regional landscape is becoming more complicated, not less. Tanga is developing as an energy hub around Uganda crude. Uganda is retaining its Hoima refinery. Ethiopia is strengthening both refining and fuel infrastructure. Djibouti remains a major petroleum gateway. All of these developments affect the market Lamu hopes to serve. That does not make Lamu unviable. It means the project must be good enough to compete. And now the bottom line. The most important thing about Dangote's announcement is not the 1.45 trillion Kenya shillings debt figure. It is what debt tells us about the scale of the bet. Dangote is effectively asking lenders and investors to believe that East Africa will consume enough petroleum products, that Lamu can secure competitively priced crude, that necessary infrastructure can be built on time, and that the refinery can operate efficiently enough to generate the cash required to service billions of dollars of borrowing. That is a substantial proposition. There is also a bigger regional equation. East Africa now has several pieces of emerging petroleum systems: Uganda crude, ECOP, Tanga, Hoima, Lamu, Lapset, Ethiopia's Gode, and established Djibouti supply corridor. The challenge is to make these pieces complement one another rather than compete blindly for the same crude and customers. Lamu could become the northern anchor of that system. Tanga could become the southern anchor. Hoima could provide Uganda with domestic refining capacity. Ethiopia could remain a major regional market while developing some capacity of its own. Several of these projects will eventually find themselves competing for markets that are smaller than their promoters expected. That is why the next stage remains more than an announcement. Watch the financing, watch the crude contracts, watch offtake agreements, infrastructure, and watch the relationship between Lamu and Tanga. If money closes, the contracts are signed and the construction proceeds broadly on schedule, the Lamu proposition becomes much more credible. If those milestones repeatedly slip, the 16 billion US dollars headline will begin to look very different. For now, the fairest conclusion is neither that Lamu is guaranteed success nor that it is a necessary project. It is a very large commercial bet on the future of East African petroleum market. And with 70% of that bet potentially financed through debt, the people with greatest interest in getting the numbers right will not be politicians or headline writers. They will be lenders. Because ultimately the question they will ask is very simple. Will the refinery produce enough cash for long enough to pay us back? That is the question that will decide whether Lamu becomes East Africa's next major energy hub or it remains one of the region's most ambitious refinery proposals. So thank you for reaching this far. If you are here for the first time, please consider subscribing to this channel. You can also watch other videos that you have made on this topic, other infrastructure projects in East Africa and Africa at large. So thank you, and let's meet in the next one.